kind of like a, she said, like a first job talk too.
Yeah, that's why they put her in the fall and not in the spring. But
we're just not going to make it public, so similar to what David said. Oh, you were here. What David
Yeah,
said last
that's why
week
I'm
was
asking.
that we're recording it, but we're not going to be circulating it online. Internal.
Continued presence in the room implies consent.
Why is everyone sitting?
It was spontaneous.
It was rehearsed.
Because then they're being strategic for when they have to make a quick exit.
Exactly. If the IRGC arrived for some of these exits.
I was going to argue just on Tuesday. I was going to use those actually. Something
How are things going, sir?
Oh, well, I ended up dropping the thesis.
Yeah, I
you guys
spoke to
know
him.
that I'm doing this, so I'd rather make you
This one?
yeah, have a
Okay, but I got a message this morning saying that they corrected my
Even so,
decision
it's
from
probably
the
for the best that I didn't really pursue this semester.
visa office at New York. All of it they're going to be because I sent them a couldn't shipping
Yeah.
So this morning
That's where the Dubba was from earlier. Oh,
yes.
the container. Dubba. It's an Indian container.
Oh, this is the second one.
Oh.
My second lunch.
I bet say it's like magically replenishing.
The other one was had lentils in it. This one is tofu and mango peanut sauce.
When I wrote to
Jam.
We only see it as a kebab.
I know, as a kebab. It's like a nice
Be
boula.
skewered.
A visible minority, right?
What happens when they break apart? Are they like a construct or something?
Well, it's time to eat them.
Also strategic because this door is open. Just so you know.
You're
I always know where my closest exit
okay,
is.
I wrote you
So we divided the, yeah, we broke up the French connection.
November. Today,
I don't bite. You're scared of me.
She does.
I think
All right, everyone. Welcome, one and all. So our speaker today does not need introductions, but I will introduce her anyway. Maryam Alemzadeh is the Harold Grinspoon Junior Research Fellow at the Crown Center. She's been with us since last year. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago, and we did not let that be a strike against her. Her dissertation was called Institutionalization of a Revolutionary Army, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in the Iran-Iraq War. I'm not going to tell you what that argues, even though that is part of her bio, because hopefully she's going to let us know, she's going to give us a talk that's primarily based on her dissertation work and lay out what her arguments in that dissertation is. Maryam, since last year that she's been with us, has been working on turning her dissertation into a book, and in the meantime has turned some of the findings in her book into two different articles, one of which has been published, and the published article is called An Unconventional Military Survival, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in the Iran-Iraq War. And she has been working, I can attest to that, on another article that she has submitted to a sociology journal called Revolutionary Armies, Civil War, and the Institutionalization of Spontaneity, the IRGC in the Iranian-Kurdish conflict, 1979 to 1980. And before I turn it over to Maryam to let us, to speak to us and inform us more about the IRGC, I do want to point out how difficult the kind of research that Maryam, and I was going to say people like her, but there are not that many people who are doing the kind of research that Maryam has done with the Guard Corps, not just reading the memoirs and looking through written documents, but actually interviewing various members of the IRGC. And so while she makes it seem easy, we all acknowledge that what the research that has gone into this talk has been very difficult to do. And with that, I hand you this imaginary microphone.
Thank you so much, Naima, for the kind introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited to share some of my research with you and hear your feedback and comments and questions. So let me start with a very specific historical moment. It's September 22nd, 1980. Only about 19 months have passed since the Iranian Revolution, and at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the news erupts that Iraqi jets have raided multiple targets in Iran, including Tehran's international airports, the photo of which you see here published in the newspaper. At the same time, 3 armies of the Iraqi ground force crossed the western border of Iran, and the thing is, the Iranian armed forces, although they had survived the revolution, but according to the best estimates, they were only at 50% of their capacity when this attack happened. And due to purges, desertions, and technological deficiencies, they were not at their best potential to counter the attack. And although the Iranian Air Force rapidly responded with a counterattack the next day, by the evening of the second day of the invasion, almost all border police stations had fallen, and the Iraqi divisions were already advancing to the province capital of Ahvaz in the southeastern province of Khuzestan. Now, while small units of the Iranian army were finding their way towards the western border, the local branches of the nascent Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had already become engaged in the fight against Iraq. At the time, the Irgc was 17 months old and roughly 30,000 men strong. It had introduced itself as a conglomerate of passionate revolutionaries who would do anything for the cause of the movement. But would the fire and the urge for involvement in action be enough to survive a conventional war? Would the Guards be able to avoid formalization, keep the passion alive, and be an efficient armed unit at the same time? The question is a timely one, I think, because massive social movements are sweeping across cities around the world, and many civilians have taken up arms to challenge the standing governments, like entered into civil wars, formed insurgent militias. So it's good to ask what happens to revolutionaries after revolutions. More often than not, the revolutionary zeal of the volunteers is contained within new institutions after a couple of years. In the words of sociologist Arthur Stinchcombe, revolutions must end for governments and by extension for militaries to be built. This is the same thing that Max Weber called the process of routinization that happens after a surge of charisma or like a revolutionary movement. And this is what happened to Iran's zealous Islamic Revolutionary Guards shortly after the 1979 revolution, or so we tend to think. We know the Irgc today as an enormous, sophisticated, and partially clandestine security and military apparatus, and it appears to run through a rigid hierarchical chain of command with Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, at the very top. And we also know that it is the most powerful, indomitable institution in Iranian political, economic, and military affairs, and that it operates through a huge bureaucracy expanding through the remotest towns and villages in Iran. Today, however, I want to talk to you about another side of the Irgc. I will talk about the Revolutionary Guards in the very first years of its existence, from 1979 to 1982, when it was neither a massive bureaucratic apparatus, nor in possession of lavish financial resources, nor unconditionally endorsed and exalted by the government. Surrounded by these unfavorable circumstances, the Guards also had to go through the test of political dispute, civil conflict, and most importantly, a conventional war when Iraq invaded Iran. And the Irgc's particular way of struggling through these events was to have a long-lasting effect on the organization, which we tend to ignore today. So how do revolutionary armies usually cope with post-revolutionary turmoil? They are either quickly professionalized in a centralized top-down fashion, especially faced with a war, to become the standing army after the regime change. You can think about the Chinese People's Liberation Army or the Russian Red Army that completely transformed and became the official army of the new party. Or if the standing army has survived the revolution, think about the French Line Army after 1789. The volunteer forces, the militias, are gradually absorbed in the standing army as volunteer units. Neither of these happened to the IRGC. Despite all the pressures, and especially the war with Iraq, the Guard stood independently of the Iranian regular army and survived the first couple of years without going through a central professionalization plan. So the question is, how did they survive and function as a non-professional military, and what did this mean for the Guard's organizational structure in the long run? The answer is obviously not to be found in the visible exterior of the organization. If you look at it from the outside, the IRGC was simply disorganized and non-professional in the first few years, as I will describe with examples later. So it is not clear what kept it together. Instead of studying the exterior or explicitly announced ideology of the organization, I investigated the interpersonal relationships, perceptions, assessments, emotions, and that the members of the IRGC experienced through those years. My goal was to find out the informal patterns of understanding and action that must be filling in for the missing external structure. And in my research trip to Iran in 2016 and 2017, I interviewed first-generation Revolutionary Guards, including a few of the influential founders and later commanders-in-chief, as well as some of the regular army officers who helped the IRGC with building their unit in the first years. I also talked to IRGC recruits of the Iran-Iraq War, including both those who had remained committed and loyal to the IRGC and those who had left in disdain. I also read published and archived interviews and reviewed relevant archived documents and news articles to screen the personal narratives where available and necessary. Through these, I saw the answer in the everyday practices of the Guards, or in Andreas Recklitz's word, in certain routinized ways of understanding the word, of desiring something, and of knowing how to do something. A practice is the established pattern of understanding and acting upon the word that makes others' behavior within a certain collectivity more or less predictable for us. Now the question becomes, what were these practices that permeated the IRGC? How were they formed and institutionalized, and how did they function to keep together a military at war, among all things? To understand these practices and their origins and functions, I'm going to quickly trace them back to January 1979, in the month leading up to the February 11th revolution. That's when the first nuclei of the post-revolutionary government, i.e. the Islamic Revolutionary Council, and the Committee for Welcoming the Imam, as it was called, were established. By then, a group of activists that we commonly know today as Islamists had already experimented with conducting their resistance within minimally organized communities. They were politically inexperienced, but they had a lifetime of lived experience in neighborhood communities inhabited by fellow Shia Muslims. Clerics were respected figures in those communities, and religion was a tangible part of everyday life for almost everyone. And a sense of cultural familiarity, molded after generations of living the same lifestyle, connected the community members tacitly. As in many old religious communities, a certain deportment was recognizable in everyday life, whether or not an explicitly religious activity was in progress. For example, in the way people greeted one another in a shop, the way they dressed, the way they treated gender dynamics, the way they entered the mosque, the way they kissed the Quran and touched it on their forehead as a sign of respect, or the way they casually talked about any of the many Shia rituals as the respective time of the year arrived. Being familiar with this deportment, with this lifestyle in which the shared religious tradition was comfortably embedded, it was easy for the small circles of activists of the same background to come together in harmony. The common understanding was that political conversations and decisions would emerge just naturally by simply getting together. More prominent clerical activists recommended others to convene in coteries whenever possible. A cleric activist says that Motahari, a prominent revolutionary figure, himself a cleric as well, once told him that he should bring together the ulama of each part of the town so that they sit together, have a cup of tea, a smoke, an orange. This very getting together is beneficial because they'll ask each other for news, and whoever has the news takes control of the meeting, and others will try to come to the next gathering with news themselves. To a large extent, such coteries were the building blocks of the Islamist informal organizations of resistance before the revolution. Now, in October 1978, Khomeini, who was then residing in France, I lied when I said January, I'm going further back, sorry, who was then residing in France in exile, proposed the idea of establishing a leadership council in Iran. The goal was not just to centralize movement leadership and harmonize it, but also to bring into the circle some individuals that were capable of running the post-revolutionary state, some experienced politicians who were not to be found among clerics, but in another branch of activists that, for lack of a better word, I'll call for now the nationalists. They were skilled technocrats that were expected to be invited in this circle for the Revolutionary Council, and they were, but they were almost immediately pushed to the margins. Ayatollah Beheshti, one of the clerics very close to Khomeini, claimed in a later remark that he convinced Khomeini to prioritize clerics and their leadership power to the nationalist bureaucratic efficiency. He said, later on, that the revolution and the people's movement is reaching a summit, but this summit is not equivalent to immediate victory. There is the danger of a crushing counter-movement on behalf of the regime and its patron, the United States. Therefore, our priority should be a nucleus that is ready for sustaining and organizing this huge mass movement, as opposed to recruiting technocrats to run the bureaucracy afterwards. Beheshti assumed that the clerics' cultural connection and ease of access to the masses gave them the edge in leading the movement. Through this exercise, a preference for limiting organizational work to individuals within this familiar circle was taken up on a more formal level. At the same time, this interpersonally defined inner circle of leadership was being emphatically associated with revolutionary ethos. And it dismissed the moderate approach of the nationalist technocrats. According to Beheshti, I think in the same interview, this lack of a quote-unquote revolutionary spirit was the reason why technocrats were not accredited with core council membership. He says, some people had been invited to the council due to their expertise, not because of their intellectual accordance with the revolution. These were invited just because they were honest technocrats, not because they were revolutionary elements who had captured the spirit of the revolution and been able to harmonize with it. Announcing them as Revolutionary Council members, therefore, or core members, therefore, would award them undue social credit. So the Revolutionary Council, after it was formed in this way, served as the first informal power hub for the clerics, which would be invoked frequently in the state-building phase. But then convening the 10 to 15 strong council based on interpersonal familiarities was not a daunting task, really. The first large-scale collective task that activists faced was, quote-unquote, welcoming Khomeini back in a manner that ensured his safety and created promising opportunities for the unfolding revolution. As you see, this is Khomeini. This is like a tiny bit of the crowd that showed up on the streets, and it wasn't a daunting task to take him safely to his residence. The collective pursuit of this task generated a second and larger revolutionary institution known as the Committee for Welcoming the Imam, which was to become the nucleus of both the state apparatus in the early days and the first revolutionary militia. Once again, a few Islamists convened and decided to form a committee and invited nationalists to join them later to take care of planning and organization that they didn't know how to do. But despite the organizational arrangement that the nationalists made, Islamist activists took the liberty to improvise where they saw fit. For instance, the committee had prepared a school in southern Tehran as Khomeini's residence, and he was accommodated there after some ordeals at the night of his arrival. The morning after, a variety of activists came to the school to visit him to take instructions about the ongoing affairs, but Khomeini was not there. A prominent Islamic cleric who was involved in the welcoming committee remembers the confusion. It was said that Ayatollah Mutahari, a prominent revolutionary himself, had moved the Imam overnight. I remember that Ayatollah Beheshti was upset. He thought it meaningless that some would move the Imam around without consulting the others. The nationalists were also upset. We went to Mutahari. He said, "I had a feeling that these nationalists are encircling the Imam and have already started to influence him. I wanted to keep them at a distance so that the Imam won't depend on them. Such dependence would harm the revolution." This is just one example among many that shows Islamist individuals afforded to disregard organizational decisions without risking either their legitimacy or their position in the collectivity. Even though clerics and other Islamist activists were unsettled and surprised with the spontaneous moves like this, they went along with them once they understood the motivation. They trusted those with whom they were familiar to go ahead and change plans spontaneously. Now, the movement progressed quickly, and on February 5th, a provisional government was installed, headed by Bazargan, the experienced nationalist. And on February 11th, the last strongholds of the Pahlavi government collapsed. The Islamic Revolutionary Council continued to operate after the revolution above and around the provisional government that was installed. And this arrangement became crucial when the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was to be born. It was only a few weeks after regime change that the provisional government of Bazargan proposed a plan to unify the many grassroots militias that had formed during the movement. But the militia leaders were reluctant to give in to this central control under the government. And the clerics of the Revolutionary Council, on the other hand, didn't mind taking over this endeavor so that they would have an armed wing independent of the provisional government. Now, armed activists of the grassroots militias recognized the flexibility inherent in the council's leadership, and after a few months of dispute, finally agreed to unify under the Revolutionary Council's leadership. And the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was officially announced in April 1979 with this logo and with an announcement in the press. The IRGC's establishment under the Revolutionary Council and the Office of the Supreme Leader, directly, like not going through the government, was yet another step in consolidating the flexible but influential leadership circles. But still, these are all small circles of elite formations that I've talked about so far. From their shared familiar spaces, leaders inherited trust and a sense that other fellows are reliable in their spontaneous decisions. Spontaneity became a practice within these circles, became the accepted and predictable routine with the leadership within the leadership circles that Islamists built one after another. As a result, these entities were flexible and minimally organized. But when the war started, the IRGC had grown to 30,000 staff, as I mentioned, staff and recruits at the same time, and hundreds of branches scattered all around Iran. It were to grow 10 times more within only 18 months after the start of the war. And this is all still before bureaucratization and professionalization gradually starts in the second year of the war. So the question still remains intact. We have just built background here. In the second half of the talk now, I'll discuss how the IRGC survived and operated on the battlefield as a massive organization. So on the highest level of command, experienced IRGC members were asked to leave other posts such as Kurdistan, where there was a civil conflict going on, to attend the more pressing situation in the southeast in Khuzestan, where Iraqi invasion was focused. But even at this level of command, the organizational potential was scarce. Those IRGC leaders who had gained some experience in other combats either were assigned to impose some order over the ongoing IRGC affairs on the ground or personally embarked on doing so. They used whatever came across their ways rather contingently and started erecting small-scale stations and offices that later helped the organization of the IRGC on larger scale. Yahya Safavi, for instance, known with his nom de guerre Rahim, it's this guy when he was very young.
Which one? The second?
No, it's there.
Second from the right standing, yeah. He had already founded a large IRGC branch in the city of Isfahan and was in charge of a large dispatch of the guards in Kurdistan in the civil conflict. He remembers in a memoir he has published that the IRGC deputy ordered him directly to go to Khuzestan, to leave Kurdistan, go to Khuzestan to face the Iraqi invasion. He goes there with 100-something guards and remembers the confusion upon their arrival at the IRGC office there. He says that after a few days, quote, "We were combat ready in Khuzestan, but did not know what front to fight in," end quote. He and about 100 guards that he had taken with him spent a month in an area 25 miles outside the closest city to cover under palm trees and stayed there with minimal backup and supplements, doing whatever they saw fit. And then they accidentally came across a suitable place to station the forces. Safavi says, yes. We heard from our watchman that a few Iraqi tanks had attacked a nearby Iranian gendarmerie station and the gendarmes had fled. I went there with a few of the brothers, i.e. the guards, to assess the situation. The station was such a proper place for our forces. A few offices, a dormitory, functioning bathrooms. So we transferred all of our forces from the open area to this building. It quickly became the station for all IRGC forces in that sector, and later, when we started the offensives, it functioned as a backup for all IRGC and Basij forces sent to that sector. Basij, by the way, is the term used to refer to the volunteers who joined the IRGC without becoming members. They usually served terms of like 3-month terms and stayed longer if they wanted to, and a lot of them did want to. So such bottom-up local formations were all the IRGC had on the ground in terms of organization in the first few months of the war. There was like nothing more going on. The interesting thing is this structuration was not limited to circles around such experienced commanders as Rahim Safavi. Others did it too. Some regular members of the IRGC across the country perceived themselves authorized to head to the south independently when they heard about the news of the invasion. They felt that what they were doing in their hometowns and like home provinces was not satisfying compared to participating in a full-blown interstate war. So they managed this degree of mobility because the boundaries of the organization they were stationed at was quite loose, or they used interpersonal ties they had established with the like-minded during and after the revolution to pull that off. Ahmad, for instance, this is a pseudonym, was serving in a non-combat unit of the IRGC at the opposite end of the country on the eastern border when the war started. He says 2 to 3 months into the war, some friends told me that they wanted to go to the front, and they suggested that I go along. We bought tickets personally. I acquired mission authorization from the IRGC and asked for the friends' names to be added to it. We did not rely on any mosque, Basij unit, etc., on any kind of organization really. I went personally. I commissioned myself. Using the connections I had, I asked them, i.e. the IRGC authorities, to give me and the friends a mission to the south. We boarded the train to Ahvaz, the province capital, like regular passengers, got the address to the place other forces from the province were stationed upon arrival, and found a fellow guard I knew already from my time in the non-combat unit to get us involved in action. Now, such individuals would then continue this momentum for direct action by building small-scale structures from scratch, just as Safavi did with a higher level of authority. 2 weeks after arrival, for instance, Ahmad, the same guy, was assigned the task of establishing a reconnaissance unit for his home province's guard unit. And he used the very minimal training and information that he had to build it from scratch. And he says, even with the low standards of the time, there was no one to fill this position. There were volunteers, but no one who could understand what it meant to be in charge of operations reconnaissance. He proudly says then, my advantage was that I had a high school diploma in mathematics. I had experience of activism. I was always trying to find out what was going on behind the enemy line. It was these characteristics that led fellow guards to give me this responsibility. He continues to emphasize how he deployed his instincts as an quote-unquote educated person, his basic knowledge of warfare based on readings as general as Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and his curiosity to explore the area in order to kickstart reconnaissance work for the province unit. What could it be? I'll fix it here.
They attacked you.
Coming in. Adventure starts that.
Must be where we are. Oh, we're not in presentation. So Ahmad continues to say, at the time I started there, we didn't even know where we were. Some forces were in Shush, some were in Ahvaz, some west of Ahvaz. Nobody knew the whereabouts of the others. We didn't know where bodies of water, swamps, and whatnots were. And when I got a Toyota pickup truck, and that was one of the very first pieces of equipment that I got, I started wandering around to see what's what. There was no comprehensive knowledge of the area, and everyone was doing their own thing. The tactics, the tricks were all dependent on individual creativity. So in general, the whole process of forming the organization and expanding it through assigning new regional or special unit leaders consisted of a chain of spontaneous responses to needs of the moment and successive trial and error attempts, even at the highest level of decision making. Such relatively independent, decentralized activity did not disrupt the cohesion of the IRGC, that's the thing to remember, at the large organizational level, due to the solid sense of belonging that lied in the core of the organization in the first place among the leaders of these small units and the central leadership. These leaders' instincts were fully trusted. The commander of the unit where Ahmad served, for example, trusted him insofar as giving him a blank mission authorization to just go and do whatever he wanted. So another trend that I'd like to seek traces of spontaneity in is the masses of volunteers that joined the IRGC in their war attempt. Excuse me, now I lost my... Okay, sorry. I'd like to see how these masses that were like in tens of thousands joining the IRGC in the first year still connected to the totality and like how it didn't like all dismantle. So outside the circles of leadership, thousands were joining as temporary foot soldiers, the Basij, as I mentioned before. Their training was limited to 2 weeks, half of which was assigned for indoctrination, and their military discipline was close to none. The challenge for the quite fluid leadership chain of command was therefore to maintain cohesion and function among the rank and file while acknowledging their urge for involvement as promised. At this stage, this style of individual initiative taking was ideologically justified and encouraged by the principles underlying the IRGC at large. It was not just at the leadership level that independence and spontaneity was tolerated, encouraged, and even sometimes required, but also, like volunteers were encouraged to adopt a similar passionately independent and self-reflective mindset. For example, in an explanatory interview right after the IRGC's formation in April 1979, one of the members of the Command Council addresses the guards, well, maybe the first batch of the guards who have been trained and recruited officially. He addresses them and compares them to Army soldiers who are trained to serve as the organization's nuts and bolts. He tells them, you are, quite to the contrary, while still respecting organizational rules and regulations, never let your mind stay idle. About different matters, you speak up, you criticize, you argue, until you are convinced that the task at hand and know what the results of your efforts will be. So, and also if a commander would try to push the organization towards a more militaristic mindset, with a clear hierarchy of command, it wouldn't work in the first place. It wouldn't be tolerated. An army officer told me, who was like assisting the guards with initial training, he recalled from the early days that claiming that the commander had the final say would not have worked, would not have been accepted in the atmosphere of the IRGC back in the days. Since everyone had a genuine feeling of responsibility towards the revolution, they thought whatever they believed was right had to be done. It was not self-centric, however, but rather out of a selfless concern for the revolution. They believed that for the revolution to be preserved, this or that had to be done. Someone else might have believed something else had to be done, and for the same cause, and these could cause controversy. But when it came to volunteering for the war with Iraq, a similar tendency for direct action was prevalent among the volunteers, among the young men. The war atmosphere was sweeping many youth off their classroom benches into recruitment centers, and many gave up their jobs and families to set off to the south to join the war campaign, and many lied about their age, tricked their families into consent, and joined the war effort. The institution these young volunteers headed to enlist for the war was the IRGC, not the regular army. This preference was rooted in the fact that the IRGC made it possible for the volunteers to act upon their desire for direct involvement, whereas the army demanded calculated moves from the command and obedience from the rank and file. Mohsen, one of the Basiji and later Guard veterans that I interviewed with, recalls this difference between the mindset, and it's quite interesting. He says, "We didn't get along with the army. They didn't believe in our system. We didn't believe in theirs. Imagine you're passing a street and see a house on fire. The reasonable thing to do is to call the fire department. But when there's neither a phone nor a fire department to call, the least you can do is to shout and make a few people aware of it. The army did not accept the system. They said, no, we have to go get prepared and act only when we're 100% ready. We, on the other hand, thought that we should chase away the enemy, even if just with a ragged shoe in our hand, to beat them with." And let me tell you, this guy was not someone to just stick to propaganda. It was just such an honest, modest guy, and yeah, actually, that was the way he thought. So, the organizational ambiguity that came with the IRGC structure was indeed a favorable setting for the prevailing mindset of independence and proactivity that many volunteers had. The other side of the coin, however, was that the IRGC was existentially dependent on these volunteers. So it needed to keep their urge for action satisfied, to keep them coming. To do anything militarily meaningful at all while on the battlefront in those first couple of years, the IRGC had almost zero resources except for the fearless volunteers. IRGC commanders sometimes enacted impromptu local mini raids just to keep the volunteers' spirit and enthusiasm up. I mean, there was no other planning going on around that operation that they designed. It was just to be able to tell them something is going on and you are being involved. So back to the question of how did it all come together, if tens of thousands of volunteers were encouraged to embark on revolutionary direct action. On the level of small groups, it's rather simple. Basijis, the volunteers, commonly looked up to their guard commanders and respected them. Hamed, the Basiji and guard veteran who became sharply critical of the organization over time and left, told me that he and his fellows had a sheer admiration of the guards in the beginning years. He says, "We thought that if we were men, the guards were supermen. That they were purer, higher in spirit, stronger in thoughts and beliefs and morals. everyone longed to wear that green uniform of the guards. There was some sacredness to it. On the basis of this respect, close emotional ties formed between the foot soldiers and their immediate commanders, but the ties didn't stop at the level of small groups, and that's where the IRGC becomes different from a lot of other militaries, where in small groups this sense of unity does exist. This time doesn't work real time. These are a bunch of influential commanders. See, Mohsen right here. I think this is from Kurdistan because because of his attire, and that's Ayatollah Khamenei standing next beside him. So the thing is, volunteers, the Basijis, projected the same perceptions of connection and feeling of support to higher levels of IRGC command as well, even though the daily interactions that made this type of connection possible between Basijis and immediate commanders were rather scarce. The volunteers formed an ideal image of the high command by projecting onto them the characteristics that they admired in their immediate commanders. Brief and rare encounters, then, with the high command, and even second-hand stories about them, were enough for Basijis, to discover signs that validated that image. Mohsen, the guy with the ragged shoe, remembers an influential IRGC commander, Borujerdi, like this. It says, "I did not have interactions with him, but only once or twice in the line for getting our meal ration. You know how someone with a high responsibility likes to receive special treatment? Our commanders weren't like that. When we wanted to eat, the line would get very long. Most of the time, you would see Martyr Borujerdi at the end of the line. Perhaps he thought, if there is not enough food, let me be the one who doesn't eat. Or you know how commanders try to dress formally and sharply? You usually notice that his clothes, Borujerdi's clothes, were ragged. It was clear that they were second-hand. Well, this is a sign of modesty." He then continued to translate this sense of respect into the image of a father, and said, "When you respect someone for what they are, it's different from when you respect them for the insignia, for the clothes. When you see that the commander treats everyone equally, loves everyone equally, then you start to like him. Instead of waiting for him to approach you, you try to approach him, get closer to him. He becomes a magnet. This is how our commanders were. We would long to see them. They were like a father to us, not commanders. When you have your father standing behind you, it's very different from when there's a commander there. You'll watch yourself and be careful not to make mistakes when a commander is watching you. But when it's your father, you'll let everything go and move forward with all your heart. You know that a commander might leave your back, but a father will not." So I should add that this relationship of an assumption of closeness and trustworthiness was not unidirectional. It existed in both ways. Immediate commanders would intentionally try to eliminate hierarchical boundaries, and top-ranking commanders had respect for the volunteers' pure motivation and did not try to contain it. I didn't include stories here because it would drag too long. But generally speaking, with the small operative units being established by different levels of leadership, and the volunteers finding the IRGC a suitable platform for participation, and the IRGC's potential for the expansion of the flexible style of work to the volunteers under its command, a flexible mass army was in the making. Through these processes, the Guards emerged at the end of the first year of the war with technical advantages that the Army started to appreciate. The bold reconnaissance missions that the Guards took upon themselves accumulated into useful intelligence over time. And the risky nighttime surprise raids that volunteers were eager to partake in gave leaders ideas on how to use such techniques on a larger scale. With these military advances, as well as the political changes in Tehran, i.e. the impeachment and the removal of the president that did not support the IRGC, the organization started its journey to utmost prominence in the second year of the war. Now to conclude, if instead of the IRGC's current massive bureaucracy, which hasn't always been there, we can agree now, or instead of their proclaimed ideology, which is strict, almost blind commitment to the supreme leader and certain values such as the dignity of the Islamic creed, If instead we look at the individual instances of action, of making decisions, of creating initiatives, and of the Guards' feelings and perceptions about one another, we see an underlying order emerge. The Guards gradually made it a habit, a practice, so to speak, to treat their collectivities as a familiar space, and to trust one another's spontaneity on that basis, just like the Islamist clerics who supported them had done before. Even when the organization recruited tens of thousands of volunteers for the war campaign, the volunteers were treated in the same way, and in turn treated their remote commanders as if they had a personal, trustworthy bond with them. Spontaneity was tolerated on all levels, and it paid off both in the formation of local pop-up units and in keeping alive the enthusiasm of the volunteer mass. And perhaps most importantly, the spirit of spontaneity aligned well with the revolutionary spirit of passionate direct action and the disregard for technocratic minutiae. In the second year of the war, after the successful operations that reclaimed most of the Iranian soil back from Iraqis, some central processes of professionalization were introduced into the Irgc. However, the practice of spontaneity had become so prevalent by the time and so deeply ingrained in the Irgc's identity as being revolutionary that it continued to be the running engine of the Irgc, especially in the remaining years of the war. And even after the war, despite heavy bureaucratization that was pursued right at the end of the war, the Irgc has preserved the possibility of operating on its informal underlying order. If you look at it from the Guards' perspective and equate spontaneity with revolutionary zeal, it looks like these revolutionaries have indeed perpetuated the revolution. Thank you so much. Should I take the questions myself?
Yes, please do.
Okay.
So thank you very much. That was really, really very interesting. I have a question that about the compared performances of the Irgc and the regular army during on the front line. Can you say more about that and how they compared, how they fared? It seems that the Irgc was involved in specific types of operations that the regular army wouldn't get involved in. I'd be curious to hear more about that.
Sure, yeah, thank you for that question. That gives me the chance to map out a lot of other details. In the first year of the war, the army was a bit crippled. Not necessarily on a technical ground, but because there was a lot of dispute going on in the political leadership, and the president at the time, Bani Sad, was under immense pressure to take quick action. So he engaged the army in 3 or 4 unsuccessful offensives, and they were poorly planned, and they achieved some results, but mostly failed. So the army was under a lot of critique by then. During this year, yes, exactly as you said, the Irgc started doing small things here and there, and that was some activity. The army could not embark on any activity because it was kind of grounded after those few offensives. So that gave the Irgc kind of an upper hand in claiming, listen, it seems like we can do something, why don't you let us? And then they had, over time, accumulated the small conglomerates of, say, reconnaissance operations, and they had the advantage of being able to recruit lots of people for risky operations, willing to take upon risky operations. But at the beginning of the second year, the Army and the Irgc started planning operations together. That's through this slope, the Irgc was elevated to the level where they were invited into the meetings, and they were asked for not an official technical opinion, but yeah, tell us what you know, what's going on the field, etc. And then they were the operations in the second year of the war were planned simultaneously by the two forces, in harmony, At least for the latter two operations, I'm sure, we have just pure parallel command. We have the commander-in-chief, the chief commander of the IRGC, the chief commander of the chief of staff of the army. Both of them have to sign by the operation plans for it to go through. So that there's no single person on top. What happens is that the army does the heavy artillery and support planning, and the IRGC provides the infantry, and they manage to cooperate and take back the land.
So at the beginning, this is fascinating. At the beginning and end of your talk, you kind of emphasize revolutionary spirit, unity of purpose, and a shared cultural consensus. And phrasing it in those ways, it allows you to tell a story about the evolution of this collective, right? This flexibility inherent in the Revolutionary Council and leadership. A pushback would be that starting from there allows you to assume away a principal agent problem that almost all economists, most political scientists, and all rational choice sociologists, for example, would say you're completely assuming away and missing. But if you go back to the beginning part of your story, the examples you give us are just filled with examples of competition and self-interest between actors, right? So you give us a quote on bringing together ulama of the town, and you say, quote, whoever has news takes control of the meeting, and others will try to come to the next gathering with some news themselves. Why? Because they want to lead, because they don't want anyone else to take control of the meeting. You give us another quote of the Revolutionary Council members fearing that the technocrats were going to show up, were going to attend the meeting and get, quote, undue social credit. You give us examples of people worrying about other people being too close to the Imam and the Imam becoming dependent on them. So those examples early on, when you're even setting that discussion about the cultural context that they're coming out of, that you say goes back generations in the shared milieu of Shia Islam there, it's still filled with stories of kind of peer equals in competition with each other. And that's part of that totally disappears in the second half when you start talking about the behavior of these guardsmen during the war. And a different narrative of what you're doing is that this was basically a principal agent problem that was unsolved. But by not solving it, it led to the IRGC that we see today. You have a lot of these experienced fighters showing up and not just acting independently, acting in competition with each other. Acting in competition with each other to say, I'm the best fighter in this area, join me. These people getting off the train and then figuring out whom to join, right? Competition between these guys where the more effective ones survive and the less effective one lead them and their recruits and the people following them into disaster, perhaps being sold out by the guardsmen next door and getting wiped out. And so you have this evolutionary process of survival in the context of high casualty, fierce fighting. That's really common, right? You see this in the early days of the Iraqi insurgency. You see this in the early days of the Syrian uprising. You go on and on and on. But so there's this element of, there's this principal agentness and self-interest of competition between commanders for influence that's just kind of missing from your story. And this larger issue of principal agent problems within the IRGC that seems really central, but it's just kind of assumed away because of how you begin in the story you want to tell us about evolution.
Just a quick follow-up. This principal agent problem is like a common term used in the rational choice literature. Okay.
Not just the rational choice literature, but anyone who's talking about organization or organizational development in companies and businesses, within organizations, within centers. How do managers get? How do you get your sales force to behave the way you want to? I mean, it's a really common sort of concept. And I think a lot of people are going to, when you're talking about spontaneity, I think that's the first thing that's going to pop into half of your audience's mind. It's an issue, it's a principal agent problem, and you're just kind of assuming it away, sweeping it under the rug.
Thank you so much. This is very helpful to think through. So I first need to make a clarification, and it's on me that it wasn't clear enough. But a lot of the examples that you mentioned are actually between this circles of familiarity of clerics, like between them on the one hand and the political rivals out of these circles on the other. I mean, of course, there is no sharp line to be drawn. There are like overlaps, but for example, taking the Imam to another residence is because to cut the hands of the political rivals out, not other clerics. The only example that there is the like inner competition going on is where the clerics should get together, and I saw it too. You're right that it seems like they want to have an orange, have a cup of tea to kind of rise the sense of rivalry, so that others come in with more, and kind of activate the whole thing. The thing is, and also in the second half when I was talking about the war campaign, yes, the examples that I brought made it appear that there was no infighting going on, which is not the case. Not as I haven't heard it or come across it to be as harshly as like the next door guard swooping under the other guard's feet. I really haven't come across such an example, but especially in the first year, when the guards were trying to establish themselves as an entity independent of another grassroots militia, which we know as comité, the committees of the provisional committees of the Islamic Revolution. These were like neighborhood watch units, basically, which had been accredited with some authority with Khomeini's decree that they should gather in the mosques and in the neighborhood centers to like continue whatever they were doing. In some of the cities and in some parts of Tehran, some of these comité units, sorry, let me say this first. These comité units were initially supposed to become, to be merged within the IRGC. The plan changed due to like some political complications, but still, because there had like a lot of comité units had popped up in every city, and sometimes in the same neighborhood there were two, or in a small city there were like two strong ones. Some of them had to be wiped out, and there were armed conflicts within some cities between the guards and the comité, or between the comité that the central government supported and the comité that, say, the Kurdish authorities supported. There were such clashes. When we entered the war, within the IRGC, on the ground, I honestly haven't come across any issues of like someone trying to take control and like be competitive. In the leadership circle, yes. In the very, very high, like as for the chief commander, there were issues. There were like infightings, but not on the ground. But you're absolutely right that I shouldn't make it appear that I'm like sweeping it under the rug. Arash, and then Scary.
Thank you for the talk. This may be a bit beyond your focus. But I was really struck in the slide with Mohsen talking about Bouloujerdi, when he was talking about equality and he was talking about his clothing and the nature and quality of his clothing. And it made me think of leftists, secular leftists who are Maoists, and this deliberate effort to kind of forge an imagined identification with people who were peasants or proletariat by wearing dirty clothes, by not taking showers. And so I'm wondering how you might situate what you're discussing, the story you're telling here, in terms of some of these global kinds of trajectories or itineraries of Maoism that were also circulating at the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question. As you know, I am in the middle of working on a piece that seeks these global trends within the IRGC. But to be honest, I don't know whether we can trace such behaviors to this global influence or to a more general, like, Islamic culture of, like, treating everyone as equals and habits like that. But what we all know is that the anti-imperialist part of leftism, and that the support for the wretched was completely endorsed and embraced by the IRGC and the Islamists, and like was introduced into their discourse through, I mean, not just through, say, Shariati and the like Islamic tradition, but also from the left. I'm afraid I don't have the data to be more specific.
So your research focuses on ground forces. Have you looked at the formation of the IRGC Air Force and Navy? When did that happen, and do you see similar patterns of independence and informality in the command structure?
That's a great question and very on point because, yes, like how would you be informal while you're trying to like land a plane, or fly a jet, right? There's just so much informality that can be involved. The Air Force and the Navy were introduced in 1985, so 5 years into the war, and they started very small. And the Navy is still very small. I do not have enough information on the IRGC Air Force, I'm afraid, but the Navy, I'm sure you know, it's these small boats that cause like the
Mischief is the word.
yeah, the mischief thing.
I mean, I would think the small boats are easy to operate independently because they're self-contained units and they can go
Yeah,
wherever
exactly.
they want.
There's not much like coordination and organization needed. But yeah, in 1985, they got the decree from Khomeini, the authorization that they could embark upon this. They started establishing military schools, academies, to teach cadre and like the experienced commanders such as Safavi and Mohsen Rezai, etc., like went to teach in these schools. And this was part of the professionalization that I mentioned started after the second year of the war. But yeah, there are multiple examples from these years. You're right, mostly in the ground force, in the army, that the practices of spontaneity were still just pervading.
Can I follow up on this real quick? Are you implying that entrenchment of informality in the IRGC led to the IRGC Navy looking like it does, small mischievous boats, and makes it difficult for them to run cruisers or more complex aircraft? Because that's a fascinating argument if you're making that.
I think, yeah, I wasn't intentionally going there, but I think that's I wouldn't be surprised if such a mentality is behind it. Yes. I'm sorry, Yazana, I got the first.
Me? Or yes?
You go ahead.
Okay.
I like you better.
So I have a small question. What first quote you gave about like people who were gathering around orange and tea and talking about news, because also they were mentioned. I also like read it as a kind of source of competition and conflict, but also what did they exactly mean by news? So was it first intelligence information, or like why did they value news, and why did they ask people to come up with more news for the next meeting? And my second question, I am wondering about your experience of interviewing IRGC members. So, and I have one particular question about how, for instance, I wonder how did they reflect on their experience, or how did they reflect on this organizational structure in the first couple of years? Were there any of them critical of it? Because at the end of the talk, you like presented us how most of the members perceived it as a kind of family structure, father, not commander. And as we all know, family is a very abusive place, right? And all like. I would be surprised if there's no one critical of that structure. So I wonder, like, their kind of reflection on the past from the present.
Thank you. These are great questions. Fun to answer. As for the first question, so at that point in the revolutionary movement, what these people did, and the clerics especially, because there were other groups who were doing like training for guerrilla warfare and planning guerrilla attacks and so on and so forth. What the clerics were mostly involved with was printing and copying. Is the English word also night letter?
Like a samizdat.
Yes.
That's not Russian.
Yeah, thank you. And then the declarations and like transcripts of Khomeini's talks, they were trying to smuggle copies through and distribute them. That was one of the news that they were discussing, who has managed to do what in the community, and also if there were occasional arrests and attacks on the revolutionaries by the Pahlavi government, the Sabak, the intelligence office. So that was the kind of thing they discussed. As for the disputes within the family, yes, they definitely existed, and I can't say a lot, but a good number of the people that I interviewed did have critical views. I mentioned that some of them had even left the organization in like starting the third year and just like went abroad. The others had stayed with it out of duty but had become super critical of it from, say, the first and second year. And they had found different ways of expressing or withholding their discontent. The interesting thing for me personally was that none of these apply to the first and second year of the war. Everyone, even the most critical ones, seemed to be happy with what happened within the IRGC in the first couple of years. It seems like this brotherly spirit was magically really there, and like the army officers who are sworn enemies of the IRGC and how it operated admitted that those first couple of years we were blown away with what we saw in these young kids. The only thing that I heard a criticism about was the way manpower was quote unquote spent in the like risky raids in those first couple of years and also later. But other than that, they like nobody disputed the originality of the motivations and the intentions. That's something I found interesting.
So thank you for the talk. I think it's for the first time that we get like all the details about your research, which is fascinating. I was wondering, like you presented the IRGC kind of like you juxtapose it to the army. So this is the other Iranian army, but you just focus on the IRGC, and you kind of present the two as like two ideal types of sorts. That one is kind of hierarchical, bureaucratic, organized. The other one is more spontaneous. And I was just wondering to what extent maybe there was an element of spontaneity within the army and an element of organization within the IRGC that maybe the two can be discussed together. If you have, I don't know if you've talked to anyone who was in the army back then. These were like part of the people that you interviewed. If they also had some stories about spontaneity or kind of disobeying orders in the battlefield. We've discussed the kind of comparable situation in Jordan in '68 between the army and the Fidayeen, and there was there were all these stories about army commanders disobeying their commanders in these kind of acts of spontaneity during the battle. So I was just wondering if there was something also comparable going on in Iran then.
That's a wonderful question, and something that, the question reminds me that I have to include this in future presentations. Yes, there definitely was these bridging experiences. One huge thing that was actually a kind of a springboard for the Guard to enter the war with some higher level of authority, and I discuss in the article I wrote on the Kurdistan experience, is that when the Kurdish insurgency happened on the western border of Iran, the army was not in good shape to be dispatched as a structured whole there. There were a couple of officers, low ranking. I don't remember the exact rank at the time, but not high in the hierarchy, that took initiative. Not like disobeying, but they went to the commander-in-chief, who was President Bani Sad, and said, listen, we want to do something. He said, I don't know what to tell you. Go do something yourselves. And they went to their hometown, which was Isfahan, the center of Iran, talked to this guy, Rahim Safavi, the guard, and asked him, do you have manpower so that they can come with us? We have like a C-130 to transport them to Kurdistan. So the cooperation happened on the ground, and during the whole Kurdistan affair, during the first year of it there as well, such unplanned cooperation was happening with the Irgc, between the Irgc and the army. There were funny clashes happening because the guards would not take command, and they were working as one unit, not separately. So the Irgc recruits were working under the army officer guy. Yeah, there were disobediences, and he could not get a hold of them. But eventually, like, something emerged out of it, and they managed a couple of successful operations. There's also a few examples that I came across of, again, army officers on at the front in the Iraq War that would take initiative, even though the army officer in charge of a particular area, say, where there is an army unit and there is an IRGC unit, the army man in charge does not agree with the IRGC plan for, say, a night raid. One of the officers comes out, joins the guards, leads the, or helps with the raid, and like the interviewee that was telling me this was saying, you know, he actually risked his position because he would be court-martialed if people found out. And I asked, so what happened afterwards? He said, oh, that was okay, nothing happened because he was martyred. He was killed in that very operation. So, yeah, thankfully nothing happened. But yeah, now man.
Thank you so much for this. I mean, I obviously have a lot of thoughts, but share a couple of them. So I think obviously I think you're onto something really important, so I just want to emphasize that, and you know that we've talked about it a lot. So and I'm just going to sort of explain the first thought I had as opposed to just laying it out as I want to, by saying, I think one of the things that would help you formalize this idea much better is the necessity to bring in how important divinity was as a trope to early war efforts. And what do I mean by that? I think part of it is, and Alireza Lusser is writing about this in the University of Chicago, about the importance of the whole notion of a miracle to both the revolution, but also exactly the post-revolutionary period, and particularly the early years of the war. And the reason this is very important is that, you know, I don't want to be a stickler historian, but I think you do need to give historical context for all the quotes that you are pulling out. Because if these are quotes of people talking about something after the fact, which is my understanding that they are, their memory is formed by these tropes that were everywhere. So it becomes almost impossible for them to not talk about their experience of that moment using language that was shaped after that moment. And the reason why the issue of divinity becomes really important here is that you know better than me that part of the argument of why the IRGC thought what they were doing was effective was that their actions were imbued with God's miracles. Now, you cannot be routinized, bureaucratized, and organized and have a sense that the divine is one of the main factors in your success, because otherwise your efficiency is the main factor in your success, right? And I think that's a really important missing element in the argument that you are making in trying to kind of lay out what they were meaning by saying all these things. Why they have to say they were ragged, why they had to say they were disorganized, because organization means that this was not an act of God, it was an act of humans. And so as I was thinking about that, I was wondering whether in some ways, what you're not arguing in a more general sense is that the way in which the literature normally talks about routinization and bureaucratization in a post-revolutionary moment is to say that this bureaucratization right after revolution is the neutralization of the revolutionary spirit. And I think what you are trying to say is that the revolutionary spirit becomes bureaucratized as opposed to be wiped away, right? So it's not because all the examples you give, the revolution is not a rupture for these behaviors. So for example, the meeting of the news, which it is not about, and I was trying to sort of think about it how it would have sounded in Persian. It doesn't read as competition. It's actually motivation for action, right? And participation. So come with your cigarettes and your oranges and your smokes. And what do? Bring in news. And if you bring more news, you can be a more active member of this community as opposed to you being more active than other people. And these are, as you know better than me, that these are pre-evolutionary ways of action that go right into the post-revolution. And I think that's where what your argument is really interesting, but I wonder, this part of you're saying that it doesn't get neutralized when it becomes bureaucratized. It becomes part of the bureaucracy, right? And this is why I think in some ways, I wonder if there's a way for you to kind of embrace the literature on bureaucratization in what you are saying, as opposed to saying the Venn diagram does not intersect. But in that intersection, say what was interesting about what happened in Iran was that it kept it as its argument for efficiency. That revolutionary spirit creates more efficient action, partly because it is defined, partly because X, Y, and Z and all the reasons that you laid out. And then I have more, but we'll deal with that later.
Thank you so much. No, this, I can only say that point taken. I don't really have an answer.
If it made sense to you, if you thought about it that way.
This is a great point. I am struggling still. I don't know if I can say that it became bureaucratized. Yes. It was kept as it being the spontaneity, the revolutionary spirit, the divinity, whatever we term it. It was preserved at least partially with the argument, with the motivation that this is our key to success. That's completely right. But does that mean it was bureaucratized?
Well, if the IRGC has become a bureaucracy, then that is the process of bureaucratization.
But it has to be, because our other argument is that it allowed them to bring in new people and grow and pretend that they had been previously a part of it. That seems to be a key part of the argument. So this, you may call it institutionalization, bureaucratization is too loaded, but this is a right, I think this is a really good point.
I mean, I see what you're saying as the ethos, the sort of original culture of the organization has survived to some extent, despite bureaucratization. That's the way I understood your argument?
Yes, no, that's the way I put it. But also, Nama and David are right that I'm at the same time arguing that it was institutionalized, if not in the nuts and bolts of the bureaucracy, but in the everyday practices and habits and the ways people went around acting. Nader.
Yes. Maryam, I was wondering if after writing your thesis in the past 2 or 3 years, have you ever tried to reach out to the same people that you interviewed or other people in IRGC and say, I have this hypothesis about your behavior. Do you agree with my hypothesis, particularly about the current times? Is it still, does spontaneity play an important role still now or not?
I haven't directly done that. No, that's a good question. What happened is that I'm very scared to do that because it ruined a few of my interviews. People started asking me up front. I'm a woman, younger, just this military men sitting in front of me sometimes. a very condescending religious person, sometimes just dude that has been to war and has so many stories to tell me. And so sometimes even without me asking, they ask me, okay, what is your research about? And they ask for my research question, not for my interview question. And I had to say something. I couldn't say it's none of your business. So I had to explain. And then the meeting became them trying to write my dissertation for me. One of them, seriously, was this high-ranking person in not Tehran, in another city, that I killed myself to get a meeting with. And then he came with this assistant of his, and I don't know, he was a university professor. I mean, they didn't even introduce themselves properly either. But that guy, that assistant guy, kept pushing me for 1 whole hour that I should go write on the role of the women in war instead. Why am I interested in the IRGC? It's nothing I can research. It's nothing that's relevant to anybody else other than security people. So yeah, it went all up in the air, and all my efforts. So to answer your question, within such conversations, the theme did come up. Spontaneity was not the word that I was using then. It was mostly informality. For example, there was this IRGC regional commander that I interviewed. He's still with the organization, and he was saying that he still tries to work around problems the way they did in the early years. For example, he was a governor, I think, a few years before I interviewed him in a city other than Tehran. And he was telling me, so as a governor, he would sit in his office, and then one time people were protesting outside the office, and his assistants were trying to calm the crowd and ask them to disperse, and that the government will respond to their questions. And he said, no, I want it to be a Sipahi, a real guard, go out, be with the people, and solve the problems directly. So he did that, and it was a much better approach, and we should solve all of our problems like this. So yeah, it came in that respect. Some others, I was this close to naming my interview. but one of the high-ranking commanders was completely denying there were any such thing as informality. He said we were super organized from day one, and the arguments in defense of this claim usually was the same as this guy that I named, Ahmad. Was it Ahmad? Had that I had a high school diploma. I knew what I was doing on the battlefield against the Iraqi armored units. The arguments are just as strong as that. There was one other.
Thanks so much for doing this. My question is about sort of the research. How were you able to sort of track down all these different IRGC veterans, especially with different sort of viewpoints on the organization? Was the Iranian? Sorry.
Okay, that's a great question. It was somewhat of a snowballing sample. Luckily, I came across a few communities of them. So, there was one big community that was still, some of them still were active guards. A lot of them were still active Basijis. They had these religious meetings every month. They had these social media groups that they invited me in, so I could see 150 war veterans chatting all the time. So it was both that, and then whoever I met, I asked them to introduce me to other people, particularly if they thought they had gone different ways. And the number of interviews that I did were not massive. I interviewed 40 plus people, and then read 100 plus archived interviews, which is a phenomenon, I think, maybe only in Iran, that they interview people, like an organization, a research institute interviews people, decides not to publish it, they archive it, and they give partial access to it. So I also saw a lot of those. Yeah.
Yusuf, you get the last question.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I want to echo what Yazan was saying. It's really nice to kind of see what it's about and like see some of the details. And again, we talked about this before, but there's a lot of similarities, even in the analysis and also the language of what people are saying, like in the early phases and my interviewees, like people who go on their own and stuff like that. It's very similar. I have just, I was wondering during all your presentation, but I think then Naomi articulated that much better, but I was kind of asking myself, isn't what made the IRGC institutionalize that spontaneity and kind of survive as a revolutionary group, the fact that it never really was in power, in sense, it wasn't like the Red Army, or it wasn't like the only organization, so from a relational point of view, it could always rely on that kind of mirror image with other institutions, and then have spontaneity or other things as so maybe an argument for efficiency, but also like an argument for distinction, right? So it's something of also the identity. So I was kind of asking myself that, but then the way you were formulated, I guess, was better. And then the other point is really more of a comment than a question, but the last word you said, you were talking about revolutionary zeal. And I had actually have a post-it in my office because I was thinking for a brief about authoritarian zeal. And I was thinking that how in Egypt, for instance, you would get a lot of spontaneity in how state agents might decide to arrest someone, or that, like, people would think, oh, this comes from the top, but it's a lot about people who are trying to be zealous in their institutions to kind of show they have a good image. And then I was thinking this is a very interesting thing if we start like a very powerful sociological concept now, because this is a state, this is the bureaucracy, this is the institution, but that inside of it, you might have spontaneity under that idea of zeal, so there might be something here to think about. And because I usually interpret a lot of what happens in Egypt, like in airports or even on the street, as issues, even the case of like Giulio Regeni, so the Italian PhD student who was killed. For me, a lot of that, I think, is about that authoritarian zeal, like people trying to show how they can be very zealous in their authoritarianism. So I think there might be, so yeah, it's not a question, it's just kind of that last word you said made me say, oh, this is a strange way we could look at that, and how we could look at actually a state bureaucracy and see how this might come into play, and then think about it comparatively. But yeah, I think this was very interesting.
Just to make sure I understood you correctly, by authoritarian zeal you mean the kind of a pretense of spontaneity within an organization where you wouldn't naturally expect it?
Because like, you're making the argument that because it's a revolutionary group, it is different from like a state bureaucracy because it has this spontaneity argument. But then I can see in the state bureaucracy in Egypt that a lot of people, because of that zeal, trying to show other people in the state bureaucracy that they can have initiative and like be even more authoritarian than the rest, they would act in spontaneity. They will do things without getting orders. They will do things on their own. So in a sense, it can be powerful because we can compare through that concept of zeal and spontaneity things that are counterintuitive because are in a state bureaucracy. But I mean, it's not very clear in my head because I'm thinking.
Can I do two things on that? Because I think the Iranian equivalent of that would be when the same groups that you're talking about war internally. There's no directive that says, tell this woman to pull her scarf forward, right? It's that exactly. Or the fact that so many people we all know have been arrested, not because there was central command, but because the guy at the passport may have been suspicious. And so I think that's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
That's how I understand
Very
it.
similar. That's very interesting. Let's talk about that more. Okay. Yeah. Might take the whole thing into a different direction.
I mean, yeah, we'll talk about it.
Thank you so much, Maryam.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes. Because
That's how you get the deadlines done.
but we have
I know.
so like this discretionary authority.
Persians say the bowl is hotter than the soup inside of it. Maryam,
Glamorous life of the professor.
Maryam, have you written at all about how the logo is exactly the logo of the Bureaucracy?
It looks like Hezbollah.
Well, Hezbollah is after this.
You will get questions about comparisons. Start out from
And I haven't started looking at the stuff.
Oh, right.
It's a
57.
logo.
Because I read. No, I read it 7. There was a couple I'm on the fence about, but I felt like you guys, especially you and I, have different ideas about the border system. So I had to leave a couple of them in that were like that were looking at like Iranian communities in LA or comparing it and doing more comparison. Like I wasn't comfortable saying no to. Just like you guys did more open about that. But I read it out as much as I could. No, there's a lot that are obvious. Like all you have to do, the first thing you click on is like, okay, this is not going to be a thing. Well, and like David had said to me, he's like, when I was reading through them, he's like,
Last week I
look at the letters.
I was having
Because they don't present their research well. Usually their closest advisors are able to articulate their work and all that. And I'm like, okay, of course.
I don't memorize first question first. Tell us about yours. I should the pop. But now each time they ask me for me, and they're like, I want to have this.
No, I understand.
Well, like next time I will be more. But still, so we will see. She didn't depend on what they are looking for.
Sure, I have all these.
Are you available anytime?
I'm teaching.
And I'm trying to
Yeah, we'll find the time. I don't know, but find the time.
I can either like come on the phone to you tomorrow morning.
Yeah, well, tomorrow morning, I'm teaching from 11 to 3.
Maybe when
Can
you
you talk to me after
we all
me?
know about
Oh, yeah.
How about tonight on the phone?
I can do tonight. Why don't I do it when I'm driving home today?
Sure. What time will it be?
You can get a ride from me.
Oh, what time did you say?
I teach till 5.
Well,
Well, figure it out. But yeah, we can talk on the phone. Yes.
The copies you raised me,
Yes,
You're
thank
in
you.
front of my desk.
Fabulous. Thank you